Hello, I guess we're ready to start. Welcome to Strategy Models for a Disruptive Time. Clearly, it's an interesting time and disruptive. I'm not going to catalog the challenges that we're facing, but clearly there's a lot to think about in terms of what this means for strategy and therefore also what it means for competitive intelligence. We have a very interesting panel, and we're looking forward to having a great discussion today. By the way, I'm looking to make this very interactive. We'd welcome you to offer both comments and questions in the Q&A window throughout. A little bit about myself. I'll be your moderator. I'm Barry Horwitz. I'm an independent consultant. I've been doing strategy work for a number of years. My background includes several years with the Boston Consulting Group, as well as over 20 years as an independent consultant. And in between, I co-founded a venture-backed startup. I teach strategy courses at the Questrom School of Business at Boston University part-time, and I'll be serving as the moderator. With us we have Arik Johnson. Arik's an historian who's been very active in competitive intelligence for over 25 years. Founder and chairman of Aurora WDC, and he's also the managing director of the Center for Open Reconnaissance. And also with me is Dr. Helen Rothberg, a strategist and professor. She teaches both at Marist College and at the Academy of Competitive Intelligence. And she is also a consultant. She's principal of H&R Associates. So we're viewing this as really a talk about strategy, and strategy clearly involves competitive intelligence. And right now, one of the things that we've heard, and we're hearing it now, and we've heard it for years, is that, boy, the times are tough and things are changing. It's really hard to even have a strategy. Things are changing too fast. Maybe we should just sort of do it and wing it. We've seen this all the way back from the 1990s and again today. I thought we'd start with that. And Helen, maybe we'll start with you. What's your reaction to that thing that we hear too often?
Yeah, I think winging it is a really dangerous way to look at how you want to invest your resources and how you want to try to engage in creating what's possible. There's always going to be things that happen that we can't control. We've got some models that maybe we'll talk about later that help us understand, maybe thinking about the what ifs. What if this happened? What if that happened? How do we go about that? But there's always going to be the need, if you want your firm to be able to achieve competitive advantage, not just survive, but to thrive, you're always going to have to be asking, what are my competitors doing? What does the environment look like? How is that changing? How do I fit? How do I be different? How can I be different? Where are the threats coming from where I'm not even looking? One thing that I found really interesting in the last really 5 years is some industry boundaries have just crumbled, and we see competitors coming in from industries that we never anticipated would be competitors we had to think about. So to always have to wing that and to not be seeing hyperscalers stepping into different industries or small tech Silicon Valley companies starting to compete for RFPs in defense or whatever it is, to not think about that and just wing it, I think is dangerous. You're always playing catch up.
Yeah, I guess wing it might have been an exaggeration, but a lot of the sort of Nike kind of just do it is kind of the mindset. Experiment, try some things, and then adjust when things happen. And I think your points are great. Arik, you have some thoughts on that?
Well, I think strategy's gotten more emergent in the sense that it is revealing itself over time as data becomes more available. And I think that's a concept that is more of a 21st century one than it is a 20th century one, in the sense that I think the 20th century enterprise formed a strategy and then imposed it on the marketplace. And I think the 21st century organization allows that strategy to emerge in a way that recalibrates constantly. And so that's the wing it part that I think is sort of the false dichotomy there, is that you're not really winging it, you're allowing data to recalibrate your choices. And then those choices, as you know, Porter so elegantly articulated going on 40 years ago, strategy is just a series of choices, and those choices always involve sacrifice. So it's something I'm very fascinated by, and something that from a historian point of view, it's the sacrifices that are the hardest for people to choose.
Right, the classic trade-offs, the things that you choose not to do,
right,
that are critical to being a strategy. I think that's a great point, and you do need some kind of direction of where you're actually going, so that you know when to react and not to react. So one of the things that it seems to have brought up, and what I've been reading and hearing from my own clients a lot, is a renewed interest in a tool that Shell Oil actually kind of brought into the business world back in the 1970s, and that's scenario planning. And Helen, I know you do a lot with that in your coursework, and we talked about that. I'd be interested in having you say some things on that, please.
Sure. Yeah, we do a lot of scenario planning and wargaming in coursework and client work, and probably safer to talk about it from the course perspective. You know, I was always amazed when working with companies. They're very ready to talk about the what next question, right? That strategy question, and even the what now question, which is more, let's put out this fire, put out that fire, and then see what we could do with it. But they never wanted to really look at the what if question. You know, what if this happened, or what if that happened? And, you know, they would say, well, that's kind of looking at fairy tales. And scenario isn't about fairy tales. It's about having a readiness mindset. And it actually responds nicely to what Arik was just talking about, because it's trying to create certainty in an uncertain world, but also trying to understand what you need to be attending to now to be ready later. So where companies are really not wanting to even have the conversation, now everybody wants to have that conversation, because what is scenario planning really doing? It's saying, okay, what really has a great impact? What's really uncertain? How do you begin to even think about that? And if it's so uncertain and has a great impact, how do we plan for that now if it might never happen, or it might happen deep into the future? And there are methods that you can use to help identify different, I'm going to use the word storylines, because I really think a great strategy is good storytelling. You need people to buy in, you need the resources to buy in, you need people sometimes to shift on a dime, and it's because the story is compelling. And the way to do that is understand not only what would matter and what's so uncertain that you have to try to think about it from dual perspectives, but how do we even know if this is starting to happen? How do you begin to set up those early warning moments that would let you say, hey, look at that, that's shifting, right? I never thought I would see Amazon, you know, competing for a DoD contract. That was not in anyone's mindset 5 years ago. So what is that signaling? And if you do it really well, you can actually, and if you're creative and you're willing to take a leap, you can begin to say, okay, if these are the things that can happen, and this is the impact it can have on this organization, what might we even start thinking about putting into place now that would benefit us for that later? And sometimes there are very simple things you could think about doing, and sometimes there are very clear early warning signals you could put in place to track, to see if you need to start making a left or a right. So to respond to Arik's point, so that's where also the emergence comes from, right? Whether it's coming from data or it's coming from events or unforeseen changes, it's signaling something's different and we might not be able to stay the same because of it.
Yeah, I think those are great points, and you cover a lot of things. Arik, I know you have some thoughts on this as well, and you have some terminology you use around this as well.
Well, you know, what Helen's really talking about there is the narrative. The narrative really is the short story about the future that you're imagining. And, you know, I think the place where intelligence most often fails is on that frontier of imagination, not imagining what might be. And consequently, all the mistakes, I think, in human history are largely failures of imagination. You know, we just remembered 9/11 19 years ago, pardon the slip. But as we remember that event in our nation's history, and really in the world's history, that was a failure of imagination, and it was an intelligence failure. It was one where we did not have a full appreciation of what might be. And so I think that's where strategy and competitive intelligence really unite, is the consideration of what might be. And a couple of years ago, we do a conference in April, typically, except for this year. We normally do a conference in April, and 2 years ago we did a mass war game scenario day, and it was essentially we actually did 3 of them simultaneously. We did one on the future of food, one on the future of money, and one on the future of health. And I wrote the initial narrative for that, which was looking 2 to 5 years in the future, and it was assuming a number of different constraints. Environmental factors, from, if you're familiar with the pestle, I know you guys are, but if our audience is familiar with pestle as a way of organizing.
Please tell them what the acronym is. In case.
Yes, pestle is short for political, economic, social, technological, legal, and and ecological, excuse me. And it's a way to kind of taxonomize some of the uncontrollables that will happen in your operating environment that you're going to have to figure out how to cope with and develop contingency control factors around. So what are you going to do when a particular event takes place that you've imagined in the past? And then how is your organization going to adapt to that new set of circumstances? Because your strategy was crafted in a world that no longer exists. You know, 4 years ago, the unthinkable happened, and Donald Trump was elected president of the United States. And that it was unthinkable to a large portion of the American populace that event could take place. I think I won't go into, you know, the consequences of that over the last 4 years, but I will say that those scenarios, those science fiction stories about the future, are what enable our colleagues to cope with those realities when they happen. In a way, you're inoculating their soul against the unthinkable, and you're enabling them to cope with the sheer terror. You know, I prefer the term terror to uncertainty, because that's how most people react to uncertainty. And I saw this great quote a few months ago about what business leaders do in times of great uncertainty. They do one thing: nothing. Right. They stop. They stop dead in their tracks, and they don't know where to go. It's a fight or flight response. It happens in your amygdala. It's entirely emotional. It is not driven by rational thought. It is, and that's the big mistake that we find ourselves in most of the time, where we unite around imagination, is we're not really in control of our own reactions. We are in control of looking for information that confirms that we were right, unfortunately, and that seldom happens.
And if you've done the scenario planning and really imagined some unimaginables, at least that gives you something to keep you from freezing entirely, perhaps. And one of the things that both of you talked about a little bit are war games, which was also, I mean, it's a very popular tool in the pharmaceutical world. There are different approaches to war games. You're sort of envisioning what happens in the environment. Helen, I think you actually incorporate war games into your course, and it always sounds sort of not politically correct, but actually strategy really emerged out of the military ideas a long time ago. So can you talk a little bit about how you use war games to inform a strategy?
Sure, and thank you for that. We do. I usually have a client pose an impossible question and identify who they think the competitors, or who they're curious in understanding would respond to strategizing around such a question. And sometimes it's really interesting because it's not what I would have expected. It's outside of the strategic group, if you will. sometimes even outside of the expected industry. And we set up teams for the full semester, and the teams will become a think tank on that competitor, and they'll do a full analysis. So they'll begin with, as Arik was just talking about, a pestle analysis. They'll go through a full competitive, a full competitor, a full internal, including value chain, financial. They'll go through 4 different SWOT models to come up with that specific answer to the question that was posed. And what's so interesting when you work with people who don't have an understanding, as you know, when you've worked in an industry, you become that industry. And sometimes it's hard to break out of the blinders of how you see the world. And you take a bunch of 22-year-olds and you ask them to think about things such as third offsets or hyperscalers, or words they might not have even ever heard of. Ask them to understand enterprise software planning, or ask them to understand how the defense industry works. They're mortified because it'll take them a while to just get the language. But here's what's so great about it. Because they really are from the outside, they look at it very differently. And they also look at it from whatever generationally their perspective is. So they'll take a very millennial or a very Gen Z perspective. We once did something for Bose a long time ago. And just how these kids saw the future was so different than how a classic company in that industry would be looking at it. And what's nice about that is you not only get to have different perspectives show up 3 months later, show their strategies, go back and adjust, be thrown, bombs that they didn't expect that changes their whole world that they have to replan around, and live through the Q&A and that whole process. But what comes out of it sometimes is a really unique viewpoint about, and I like Arik's word, the narrative about what's possible and what the future can be. And I think, I'm a consultant and Arik's a consultant also, and you as well, Barry. And we, we like companies to engage in these processes, not just because we're trying to create business, but it's really important for them to stay vital. Because I think companies really get stale. And if something has worked, it's almost the worst thing that can happen is you've been doing something that's really working well, because then you're afraid to look outside of it and shift. The blinders, right? It's always worked for me this way, and we've been doing it this way for 100 years, and I'm sure Kodak said that as well, right? And when you have that outside perspective of people who, they want their great, but they're not married to the outcome. They're really not as fearful of stepping outside the box and seeing what happens, or seeing how they respond to these different changes that can occur in a minute. And I think that's where the value of wargaming is, not just to consider alternatives and consider how competitors might be responding to something, but to also see how those who don't think the way you think look at the same thing and can see it very differently.
That sounds great. We actually, I did some work with a major pharmaceutical company in a Latin American situation where they basically tried to bring their country managers and the salespeople in because they have a perspective that headquarters never has. And they basically said, okay, pretend you left the company today and immediately went to work for our major competitor in this market. And now, what moves are you going to make? And we set up the thing that way. It's another outside perspective from reaching out to the front lines of an organization. And I think that's another angle. Arik, can you talk more about wargaming? Do you deal with that as well?
Yeah, so war games are there to test strategy, not to formulate strategy. And I think that's the right perspective to have on what that process is all about. It takes a certain level of humility. You may have heard my question for Liam when Cynthia asked it in the opening keynote this morning. How do we help our future business leaders cope with the human frailties that are exhibited by their unhumble reaction to the world? Humility is a really, really important characteristic here. In fact, I use it as a qualifier now for the types of clients that I want to work with. I'm at a point in my career where I try and learn whether or not there's anything I can teach them they don't already know. And if the answer to that is no, then I probably don't have a big interest in, trying to help confirm their biases about reality. And I think that's another part of this, that you touched on there, Barry, in your comment was, there's one reality, there's one truth, so to speak. And that truth has an infinite number of perspectives on it. And the synthesis of perspectives in order to give a higher resolution version of the truth. That's what we do as intelligence people. Intelligence people reveal the truth about reality that already exists around us, and then helps those who are somewhat less imaginative to think the unthinkable and dream the impossible, as you suggest, Helen, with your impossible question. And so, that really is the value. The value is in the difference that you make. That same conference I referenced a few minutes ago, the first time we did it in 2013, we had a very, very experienced intelligence leader and manager who built programs at half a dozen companies and in the intelligence community at the national security level before that. And he got up and his opening line from that keynote was, if you put together the most insightful, creative, and compelling analysis of your career, and your decision or policymaker doesn't do anything differently as a result, whose fault is it? And pin drop, kind of quiet in the room, and he points at the audience and he says, it's your fault. And I think that's a big part of the responsibility that comes with the yoke of the intelligence analyst, the provocateur, as we like to call them, the ones who ask questions that everyone else is afraid to ask, is what might be, and then how do we figure out how to cope with that? Because we may not make money at that. We may not make money managing risk. And incidentally, if I'm the average CEO in a Fortune 1000 corporation today, I'll be long gone by the time the SHTF, so to speak, and they have to figure out what to do about it. It won't be my problem anymore. I'll have my golden parachute and I'll be out of here. Now that short-termism isn't uniquely American, but it is uniquely, in some ways, Wall Street. And so we have a very difficult set of constraints and expectations by shareholders that we have to fight against. And I think you're seeing some shifts in that. You're seeing some shifts today away from that strict shareholder value creation, metric, which is traditionally going back, I think it was 1967, Milton Friedman wrote that piece where he defined the purpose of business as creating shareholder value so erroneously. And the clarification of that purpose for what business is about, which is really to create customers. If you think of kind of the response to that you've seen in the last 40, 50 years since, is that, the real purpose of business is to create customers. And when you can appreciate that there is often a detriment to the shareholders that come as a result, short term at least, you can then begin to absorb some of the complexities, I think, that our largest enterprises have to figure out how to navigate.
Sure. It raises an interesting thing I hadn't been thinking about in our earlier conversations, but in a way, because of that, and one of the reasons we're seeing some of the change, I think, now, may be that when the whole world turns upside down, like a pandemic, a kind of thing that nobody anticipated, well, actually people maybe had anticipated, but those guidebooks have been thrown away, you got cover. All of a sudden, the world has changed, and you may have some decisions you wanted to make or some things you wanted to get out of but couldn't because of short term. Now you've got cover. Has that opened up an opportunity? Have you seen some companies do more with that? I don't know, either of you could comment on that. Looks like Arik, you can.
Well, I'll just say that I used to give a speech. I haven't given this speech in a while, but I used to ask 3 questions, and I would ask, what is the probability that a disease outbreak will affect your supply chain? What is the probability that an accident will affect your operational continuity? And what is the probability that there will be an unthinkable event that will affect the economics of how your business model is designed? And I'd ask those dramatically, somewhat separate from one another. The answer to all three of those questions is, of course, 100%. 100%. It'll definitely happen. And this was at the time of the Fukushima accident in Japan, which, by the way, shut down the one plant in the world that produced solenoids for airbags for the automobile industry. Now, the concentration of cost structures that lead to that sort of weak spot in the supply chain is understandable, because we're here to drive cash flow, right? We're here to make money. And that's how you do it. You make money by reducing the cost structure of your operation. But if you do so at the expense of your continuity planning, which, if there's I mean, what are the odds that Fukushima was going to have a nuclear event as a result of an earthquake? 100%. So that's really what risk management is about. And I know that risk management is something that is a very kind of math geek, finance sort of thing, but that's really how we have to get inside the halls of the C-suite as strategists and intelligence analysts. Is we've got to help them confront what the real risk array is to our operating continuity. And the pandemic is, a perfect example of that. I predict that in the next 5 years, maybe longer, because I think it'll be a long economic depression that we're going to experience here. God help us. But I predict in the next 5 to 10 years, you're going to see a real boom in what it is we do. But a lot of it will be because of the risk management and the limited opportunities for growth that are going to emerge in the 2020s globally. And then the repolarization of the global economy into really the China pole and then the West, so to speak. I think you're going to see a massive decoupling there. And as that story plays out, that is pretty much unthinkable right now. The end of the dollar as a reserve currency 6 months ago, nobody was really talking about it. Now, there's a lot of people talking about that. And here's my other prediction. We're going to have a manufacturing renaissance in the United States of America in the decade ahead, because we're going to have to make all our own stuff again.
Yeah, I was going to say, the relationships between China, we already have somewhat of two internets, but I think that could be even more with the issues around chips and Huawei and the like. And I think nobody anticipated the British Empire not ruling the world forever, and these are not things that are the only time. I seem to remember a time when the only plant that made something that enabled you to make black paint was shut down. I don't remember where that was, but so no black cars could be made for quite a while, because again, we had a single point of failure. That hasn't stopped us from continuing to have single points of failure, which we'll see again, I think. Helen, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's interesting how we never seem to learn from history. I've been having a lot of questions from some of my clients about strategic resources. What's really strategic as far as risk management goes? And I agree with Arik that there's going to be a manufacturing shift, for not just because we're going to have to make our own stuff, but I also think there's going to be a real kind of virtual technological change in how things are done because of our use of data, and because we can automate, and because you can pretty soon be able to run an automated factory from your living room if you need to, because of all the ERP systems being built.
We'll just print it
in. But strategic resources is really an important question. And we used to only think of strategic resources in the States, in my opinion, as something called oil. Yeah, and now it's not so strategic. Probably data is the most strategic resource, but it's even deeper than that. I see what we haven't been doing as risk assessors is think in systems. Everything has an input, something happens, something comes out of it, it's going to affect everything else. And in that quest for the Wall Street quarterly earnings call going well, I think there's been this chase for profitability over taking care of our strategic resources and our stakeholders. So if you even think about, so we have a pandemic now. We're not really quite sure how to really treat it yet. Even when people get it. My husband's a physician. He's a pulmonologist. We've been in the front line. We've been living COVID every day for months now. Nobody really knows. Steroids are always in there, but they're trying to figure it out. But the truth is, even if it was a certain antibiotic, 90% of our antibiotics are made in China. They're not made, I mean, that's a strategic resource if you think about it as a nation. Antibiotics, basic, like shouldn't there be multiple sources this comes from? Shouldn't there always be some that are made here? And I think finally, there's some thinking about what really matters for quality of life and well-being of not just a company, but a people's, a nation, of your culture. And how do you safeguard that? And how do you make sure that not just your supply chain is distributed, so it's not all coming from Southeast Asia or Asia, but all over the world, but also locally. So if it's needed immediately, it's there. What happens if your grid goes down? How do you make any of this work? And I think finally, instead of clients looking at people such as us and saying we're crazy, or we like to tell stories, or Arik's narrative is my storytelling. They're coming back and I'm getting phone calls saying, okay, I get it now. I see it now. How do you begin to identify what's really strategic? How do you begin to identify what's at risk? And how do you begin to create the safeguards against those risks? And then how to identify what I don't even know how to identify yet. And that's where I think the scenario pieces start to come in. And you begin to really understand what makes what you do tick. Is it going to remain relevant? And how do you keep it running?
Some great points. I mean, I think the concepts of backup suppliers or safety stocks went out with trying to make quarterly earnings, right? And I remember we looked at a pandemic. I was involved in something where we looked at pandemic modeling with the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center back in 2006. At the time, that this was the H1N1 virus, and maybe the problem is it didn't actually switch from animals to humans. So everyone thought, oh, okay, well, we don't really have to worry about that. If it happens again, it'll be off in the future. Speaking of off in the future, I mean, there are a lot of things that, we're talking about the political side. One of them that we're dealing with as we watch our entire West Coast be on fire is this climate change, which is also rather urgent and yet pushed out of the side until we can figure out something on the pandemic. But that we probably need to model that and think about how to incorporate that in our planning as well. Arik, go ahead.
That's that, the E on the end of pestle is ecological.
Right.
Yeah, so there is definitely an inventory of, we call them control factors. And in this domain, they're contingency factors. So what ifs? How will we respond if? Because the ability to influence those contingency factors is so infinitesimal usually, and the results of that that's where a lot of your risk management array comes from. And as you think through, just take rising sea level as one of the topics there, and I will leave out of the debate whether it's caused by man or not, but those seas are rising, you may have noticed. And so our ability to have population centers, something like, I forget the number, I want to say it's 70 or 80% of humanity lives on coastlines today around the world. And if those coastlines are underwater, where will those displaced refugees end up? What will they do for food? What will they do for work? What will they do for law and order? How will this affect the notion of the nation or strategic trading blocks? I think that's really what comes out of the E for ecological is, what is the inventory of consequences that we're going to have to plan contingencies around, because there are probably opportunities there. That same event where we did this scenario war game thing a couple of years ago, we had some entrepreneurs come, and at the evening dinner, we worked them through a makeover. We call it a demolition process, and we take them through the demolition of their business model, where we reveal all of the frailties, and then we try and turn those frailties into things that'll get stronger, or anti-fragile, to use the Taleb terminology. Take those weak spots and make them stronger under stress. And one of the young men who had a business there was selling solar power generation units into sub-Saharan Africa. Not particularly, rich place to do business, but a very particularly needy place. The need is very, very strong there. And his rationale behind it was really beautiful. It was kind of the play on, New York City a little bit and Broadway. If I can make it there, I can make it anywhere. If he can build a business that has a cost structure that works in sub-Saharan Africa and provides electricity to people's homes in a renewable way, he can do that anywhere. And that's true. And I think that's the kind of takeaway that I have from a lot of those ecological things is you're going to have to redesign your operating model, and the odds of that are 100%. The question is how you're going to do it. And there's a very important principle, I think it's a Greek, I don't know who said it, but I think it might be just a saying, that all human progress is based on people who plant trees under whose shade they will not sit. That's a really, really important thing that we've forgotten in the era of shareholder capitalism, which is that it's not about you. It's about what you leave behind when you're long gone. And I think that is that sort of revolution that's taking place across all of those pestle factors, political in particular, but also economic. And I think the ecological is a big driver of that, is that our parents and grandparents didn't care about the environment, and now we have to pay the consequences as the sort of millennial, Gen Z, et cetera, are looking at the world and the realities around them. And so I think what you see on the West Coast right now, the wildfire, tragedy that's happening is a great reminder to us that we do have an impact on the world. The way we organize our work and our ability to deliver value to the marketplace needs to take into account whether the marketplace will be on fire in the future. Because if that's the consequences of our actions, that's not a very responsible way to serve our stakeholders, our shareholders notwithstanding. And by the way, shareholders, high frequency trading has changed what it means to be an investor today. And the kind of final remark on that point, and then I'll let Helen get a word in edgewise here. I'm sorry. Every intelligence project or program I've ever worked on in the 25 years I've been in this business, the bottom line question is around where to invest. Where to invest to produce a desired outcome in the future. And if that's not a part of the mission clarity or the desired yield is the answer to that question, I actually don't believe there's an intelligence project there.
Helen, if I could, before, I know you do want to respond to that, but we do also have a question that came in from Parmalee Eastman, and she's asking how an organization decides what resources to devote when you're thinking about investing in this very low probability in the near term, but very high impact issues like pandemics and their impact on that. I mean, how do you decide? I mean, we've decided to put way too little to it, but how do you decide how much? And now, and to some extent, maybe how do you avoid locking the barn now that the horses are out? But, Helen, maybe, I don't know if that.
So I just want to make sure I'm understanding the question. So in the world of scenarios where it's all uncertain and unknowable, where you're trying to create certainty, how do you know where to invest your resources?
Yeah, I mean, you sort of have to, I'm reading from it an implication that you have to decide, do you invest a lot and be really safe, or a little because you think the probability is low? How do you gauge where that point is?
The answer is it's incremental, right? It's an incremental process. So all strategy is about where to invest, right? Strategy is about placing a bet. Right. That you're hoping one outcome is going to be better than another, and you're going to take your people, resources, and things and try to focus it in that way. But good strategy would have different checkpoints that you know your vectors here, you're trying to reach something over here, and you want to see how you're going on your way to see how much more resources to invest at different points of time. And it's the same thing with scenarios. If you are identifying different types of scenarios of what if that could be so impactful, if you could find that strategic imperative, those few things that, and we do this, you know, when actually we do our training at ACI, those few things that if you made investments here, regardless of which of these different options would happen, you would be okay. That's how you would do that. So it's really identifying what those core, definable, discernible pieces of intellectual capital or know-how, or any of those things that are endemic to who you are as a company that are part of your character. Those are the things where you would begin to think about investing. But it's really about identifying, and it's hard to be, you know, I can't give you an example because I can't, but it is about identifying those places that in your organization that you really can't do without, regardless of what happens, and making sure you invest there. And then having different early warning signals and strike points that if certain things begin to appear, start to occur, this change happens in the economy, this consumer need changes, this regulatory issue changes, that you are ready in your thinking to know where to go next. So sometimes it's not even really investing dollars as much as it's investing in planning and thinking on the human side, so you'll have a reaction ready that you can move to and a plan ready that you can move to. You know, it's interesting how if we really stop and step back and really take, you know, an accounting of where we're at and what we're doing, even for the environmental thing, you know, sometimes there really are things that we could have been doing all along that would have made that unpredictable thing that happened, that horrible thing, maybe not even as impactful. For instance, the fires, you know, unfortunately, the West Coast is burning right now. And Australia had a similar issue a few years ago. And one thing that we used to do in this country, and that the Aboriginal peoples in Australia did when they ran the lands, is they did a lot of land management. And they would rid the land of brush and things on some kind of circular basis that they know, if it gets really hot, are going to ignite. We know that there are lightning storms every so often. I don't know how many, you know, 10s or 20s or 5s of years it is, but we know that if it's really hot out and it strikes this brush that's not maintained, that it could catch fire, right? So that's something we probably, with good management and good strategy, could have done something about. It might not have stopped the fires, but it might have stopped the impact and the devastation that we're seeing now. So sometimes I think trying to have that risk assessment and trying to think about where to invest to be ready for the future is also looking at what could you do now that would make any time better, which sometimes we absolutely overlook. I mean, people still build their homes on fault lines and in canyons where they could slide down if you get a lot of rain in California after you've had a lot of drought. I mean, there's some way that we as humans perceptually believe that that we're always going to be okay.
Yeah, it's going to be fine now.
That we, you know, I am a cautiously optimistic person to a fault. I am. It's always going to be half full, but I'm also a realist, right? And there are also certain things we can do that actually could help us have better outcomes right now if we want to admit what we don't want to see, what's right in front of us, things we could do right now. And I think, and Arik said something I really liked before, that, you know, part of what our job is as intelligence folk is to really tell people what's right in front of them, what's right there that they don't want to see, because it's working, we're doing great, I don't have to pay attention to this. No, you do. It's building that landscape, and landscapes are seeable and knowable. And I think that's part of managing risk and also managing scenario, and also to answer that question, to know where to invest. Invest in what you can do now to make it better.
Right. Great. Arik, you clearly wanted to jump in on that as well.
Well, I'll just add that I think where to invest is a question that's driven by your investment time horizon. You know, when do you expect it to pay off? And when, I think in modern sort of investment parlance, when is your exit from the asset that you intend to invest in? And that's that finite mindset. You know, Simon Sinek had this great book that came out about a year ago called The Infinite Mindset, The Infinite Game, actually, I think was the title. We did a planning exercise. My company did an all hands planning exercise in Gatlinburg, Tennessee in January, and that was the text. And so it begins with having a just cause. So defining for your organization what its infinite game is and the infinite mindset that accompanies it has to have a just cause. And I think that's where investment is being changed. It's no longer about simple dollar results, you know, return on capital or what's the term the accountants use? Return on invested capital, ROIC. That metric is no longer the only thing that matters. It matters that the enterprise survives the extraction of my capital, which is no guarantee in a lot of organizations today. I don't remember how many Fortune 1000 companies have filed for bankruptcy in the last 6 months, but it's a lot more than we expected. And I think that, simple reality is one that is very deterministic for a lot of business leaders, is they have a really hard time coping with seeing a future that they're not involved with, that doesn't involve them. That's the ego element that I think is such an enemy of success here in how intelligence and strategy crafts that narrative for the future that is then intentional and something that people can actually build a business around. And I have a lot of hope, I think, in the younger generation. My kids, my oldest is 17. He came to work for the company when he was 14, and it was legal for him to do that. Most of my kids will eventually work in the business, but they'll do things that give them not an appreciation for being an intelligence entrepreneur. I want them to be an entrepreneur, period, to see that if they are able to take some ownership of their own financial destiny, then it doesn't matter what they choose to do. They can change course later. And the analogy, Barry, that I used is that today strategy is a lot less like chess and it's a lot more like surfing, because in the old world, it was us or them and us versus them and zero sum. I win, they lose. What was it Larry Ellison used to say? It's not enough that I win. Someone else must also lose. And I think that mindset on reality is not just counterproductive. I actually think it's suicidal in many ways, because it forces you into this choice making around, this false competitive horizon. You instead are not these chess players trying to be slightly, more insightful about 8 moves in the future. You're a surfer who's trying to ride the same wave. And if some guy or gal jumps in front of you and they ride that wave instead of you do, well, you've missed your opportunity. And that goes to the point of time itself. The reason I call myself a historian is because time is the only resource you can't get more of. When it's gone, it's gone. You can always go out and raise more money. You can always go out and get more talent. You can go out and acquire more IP to help you do what you do. You can spend billions building a brand or, whatever your business objectives are. We've got MBA programs that pump out really qualified managers and operators every day of the year to do that type of work. Time is exhaustible. And when you're out of it, you're dead. That's why they call it the dismal science, right? Economics is the dismal science, is because at the end of the story, we're all dead. So the point, I think, in my saying that is we need to, I think, as an economy and as choice makers in that economy, we need to think beyond our own demise and think about what the future holds for those that we love and who we hope will have as, lovely a life as we've had, hopefully. I'm glad that my ancestors did that for me, and I hope to return the favor.
Right. As I was thinking about that, I'm thinking about the historical aspect of trying to think about, say, when MCI tried to launch one of those win-lose battles against AT&T for long distance, and then eventually Skype made it free for everybody as long as they had a computer. I mean, if you're focusing in too much on that one battle, you could miss with something else that goes and takes it away. But one of the other topics we've been thinking about has to do with investments. We've been talking about investments now from the protective risk management side. There's a lot of data that keeps coming out every time there's a downturn like we're facing today, of how companies that invest during the downturn end up outperforming their competitors, catching the better wave perhaps as they do that. Now, a lot of people immediately, besides doing nothing, they immediately shut their wallets and tried to hunker down and last this out. But there's a lot of evidence that they should be investing. How does a strategist think about that, or how can you use CI for that as well? Helen, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it depends on what you want to be investing in. Are you investing in what potentially could be next? Or are you doubling down on where you are now? I think I've been seeing some of that literature too, and it comes in waves, right? It always comes in waves. I think there's a little bit of a danger in not thoroughly thinking through what it is you want to be next. I'm a great believer in vision. I've worked on a lot of executive searches also in my life as a consultant and as an academic. And as Proverbs would say, when there's no vision, the people will perish, right? So if you don't really know what you want to try to achieve in that bigger sense, you're not going to know what really to invest in. So there's a way of investing when people are fearful. That is, this has worked before. I really believe in this. Let's get metals. Let's make sure we put a chunk of this in gold, and that's what's going to, because gold is important, and they'll start throwing that way, as opposed to saying, well, what's going to be on the other side of this, and there's an important point in there that Arik made before as well. What is the time horizon? What is our turnaround? Right? I'm hoping one thing we might come out of this pandemic with is a little bit more of a longer term view, because the short term we don't have short term now. I know too many restaurant owners in New York who decided to take over a lane of traffic and put tables in there because they couldn't wait until they were allowed to now have 25% of the people in the building eating at 4 tables. They can't survive that way. Right. So it's really about, I think, doubling down on what's next. And what do you see is next? And where is there going to be opportunity? And what do you think will change and why? And not just doing it from a heuristic point of view, but doing it from, in data intelligence, analytics, and then a leap of faith point of view. Because at some point, you have to jump off that ledge and see where you're going to land. And that's where I think, so yeah, I think there is investing when there's a downturn. I think there is always hope. Again, my personality, time is fungible and hope is eternal, because when you lose that, then what do you do with yourself after that, right? And I think it's about saying what's really next and being able to try to do it. And here's the challenge, at least for the business people I've been working with, is to keep their head about them. There's a real maturity is not an age thing. So being able to feel all of the stressors and pressures of, can I keep people employed? Am I going to, what's going to happen to my business? Can I hold onto my building? Do I have the right technology? And to say, how can I do this better? How can I do this differently? What will it take? Where am I willing to make those trade-offs? And sometimes it's people for technology and whatever it is, and investing in that way moving forward about what's next and what you're going to create and where you're going to create value for, and I'm going to use this language, the stakeholders, not just the shareholders, for all the stakeholders moving forward, which are your suppliers, which are your buyers, which are the people who work for you, which is the community you live in. It's the government, it's all of that. So I think that's the viewpoint I would get behind. And where do you double down now? You double down in what's next.
Excellent. Arik?
Amen. So I think there are there's two types of people in the world. Those who say there's two types of people in the world and those who don't. No, there's two types of people in the world in the sense that there are those who are very loss avoidant. I don't know what the right way to describe that is, but they're very focused on retention of whatever it is they currently have or have worked for. I think it's the way we sort of put a stake in the ground and try and make progress through time. And then there's people who, and I fall into this latter camp, naked I came into the world and naked I shall leave it, right? That there is no fear of loss because it maybe was never really mine in the first place. And I think that is more of kind of the shamanic, perspective on the world, is that you are thinking about, I had this great conversation yesterday with somebody, I won't tell you who, but he said that point of view suggests that where will you store your extra food? I'll store my extra food in the bellies of my community members. I'll store it in their stomachs. And that perspective on reality is one that does not necessarily concentrate wealth in the same way as the perspective that fears loss. And I think this is generational. I think there are generations that if you sort of move through time, and I'll speak as an American, here in this respect, I think it's different in other parts of the world. What you see happening in China right now is really a reaction to what happened in the 1970s, with the Cultural Revolution and a lot of that sort of perspective on reality. Versus here, what's happening in America right now is that the people who are in charge are reflecting on what happened in the 1950s and 60s when they were growing up. And you'll see that move through time, I think, going forward as these generations take control of society and then think about how to reinvest. And that how to invest question becomes, am I really afraid of losing what I have? Or am I really, did I ever really have possession of it in the first place? And instead, it's a matter of working together to create a richer society. So back to business here, the business question becomes, what is business culture? I think you had the Enron culture of the early aughts, which suggested that anything goes. The ends justify the means. And did they know at Enron that their operating model was unsustainable? Yeah, well, obviously, they can't keep making up financial results, forever. But I think that's the kind of generational leapfrogging that I think we're doing right now. And I think it's happening because of the pestle factors, the contingency factors that are arrayed in our society right now. Did anyone see the pandemic coming? It was inevitable. I think we can all agree it was inevitable. Did anyone know that there was going to be such a dire economic calamity as a result of the pandemic? That's the thing that was unthinkable, I think, 6 months ago. And still today, how many people in your extended network, friend or professional, want to get back to normal? Is that the content of your conversations? Can we just all get back to normal and get my kids back in school? And, I was going on vacation in October and all that stuff. And I've had to have these conversations with folks saying, listen, we just spent 6 months proving that the business world doesn't need to send their people out on the road to travel. So between 70 and 80% of the travel economy is underwritten by the largesse of the business traveler. So if you're used to paying $300 to fly to Orlando to Disney World for your family to spend the week at Disneyland or whatever it costs, quintuple that. because that's the real costs of doing that particular activity. It's just that you don't pay them. They were indirectly underwritten by somebody else. And that's my point. When it hardens into economics is really, really tough to recalibrate. It's almost impossible to recalibrate without a war, or a revolution of some kind. And I think that's where a lot of revolutions take place, is civil conflict and war between nation states result from economic disparities that is the only way to change them, because the haves want to keep and the have-nots can't eat. So anyway, I'll let you get a word in, Helen. Apologies.
Well, that triggers a thought that I definitely do want to pass to the cautious optimist on us, because it is really, in addition to the fires and the pandemic, we are dealing with social unrest that is driven from, George Floyd perhaps as the trigger, but something that's been in the background or in the foreground of, for some people for quite a long time. And we are getting the haves having more, and the digital divide is creating some more things. So we're looking at that as well. And that's got to weigh into the calculation of either what companies need to start to do if governments can't do it, or how we mitigate some of the risks of actually heading to a revolution. So with that, Helen, I'm counting on your optimism to bring us back.
Yeah, so it's interesting you say this, because I was one of those kids marching, in the 60s and 70s. And so to really clean out, to really heal an infected wound, you have to clean out the wound, right? You have to get all the crap out of it so that it could start fresh and grow new tissue, and the antibiotics or whatever you're going to put on it are going to work. And I think for a long time, a lot of truths were covered over. And whether it's the truths of the largest is such a good word for the business traveler, right? Because we don't even have to talk about the expenses and the craziness of that. And was it ever really needed? And have we learned that, there is no more normal. And I don't want to use new normal because I just hate those acronyms, but we're all going to be different because of what we've just experienced, as we should be. We should learn the better lessons. We should learn that it's better for people maybe to be home and have dinner with their children than to be traveling 3 hours every day commuting to and from work. It's not needed. It's not necessary. Do you need to see and physically be with people sometimes? Of course. Do you have to do it every single day? Probably not. Then interesting information just becomes daily gossip, right? So, there's a lot of what these new normals are, but what, as the eternal optimist will tell you, and from the kid who grew up in a ghetto during a very difficult time of our nation's history, once you can have the exposure and once it's all out in the open, as ugly as it is, now we can begin to tell the truth and see what we could do about it. And is it going to happen overnight? No, this isn't Hollywood, right? This is about scenario and strategy and all of these things that we're talking about, right? So what we are starting to see, which we hadn't seen before, is our discussions on allyship, which I had never heard before in the way I'm hearing them now. And forget about hearing discussions, because the talk to me is very cheap. I'm actually hearing less about mentorship and more about sponsorship. Let's put people in situations where they could do things differently and begin to make some changes. Is this just a fashion, a folderol? Maybe. Is it a trend? I hope. Will it help make things a bit different? We'll see, right? We're going to know a lot more after November, and I don't want to go there because that's not what this one's about. A
lot of scenario planning going on around November too, but let's not, I agree.
Let's not, because our heads will explode. Yep. But, to be able to go forward, you need truth. I think a lot of, I'm going to make one quick shift here with your permission. I think a lot of, this is all about different kinds of relationships, right? With the economy, with communities, with businesses, with competitors. It's all about relationships. Relationships are what make everything work or not work. It's what drives even strategy and how do you get strategy to happen? We all know you can be the best damn strategist out there. You can have the best arguments backed by the best analysis and the best data. And in the end, it's whether or not that decision maker kind of is going to agree with you and choose to invest resources there, right? And that's partly based on your relationship with that person, your storytelling, your narrative, your relationship. And if we want to look at what relationships are really made of, I've been thinking a lot about this lately because it's part of my next writing. But, you know, you have to be able to communicate. You have to have humility. I have a model called chat. You have to have authenticity and you have to create trust. And if we could do those things instead of creating conflict and using hubris and acting instead of being authentic and creating treachery, right? If we could do the other side of that, then we could start to create positive change. And if we could build that in the people we work with and work for and our communities, we could start creating positive change. But you have to have truth in there. So yeah, you got to expose the ugly underbelly. And once that's exposed, then you can begin to truthfully work about making it different. What's never going to work is if you keep putting the Band-Aid on the festering wounds, or you put on the special color that everybody likes this week on that. You know, it's about stripping all that away. And even in a company and saying, you know, there are myths that all these companies hold near and dear to their hearts. And a lot of them are BS. A lot of them are stories that aren't true. And because people hold these myths and it becomes part of the lore of an organization, they can't shift. They can't see the truth. They can't do what they need to do next. You know, Lehman Brothers, Kodak, we could talk about a lot of companies, not to pick on anybody, who got stuck in their own stories that weren't really built on truths anymore. So once we get to the bottom of that, then I think we can go forward in a better way. And is it going to be better tomorrow? No. Might it be painful first? Yes. When organizations have to change is, you know, forgive me, it's early in the day for this, but we can't control what happens, but we can choose how to respond. And you can choose to look at it as shit or fertilizer, right? Is this really just shit or fertilizer? And if it's fertilizer, you're going to find a way to do it differently, make it better, and make it work. Doesn't mean you're not going to suffer along the way first, because anytime you unravel something, it's tough. But it means that you can then take it to a different place. And I really think at the core of what we do in CI and what we do in strategy and what we do as consultants who are also really educators with a different jacket, maybe a more expensive suit, right? Is we're trying to do that, right? Yeah. We're trying to help create what's going to be next and help do it in a way that's as minimally fear-driven as possible, because it's the fear that's going to stop the change that needs to happen.
You know, they're great points, Helen. Thank you for that. And it strikes me that one of the challenges in communication has been the compression of time to digest. You know, there used to be a news cycle. Now with 140 characters that a million people can read in 30 seconds, you know, it's hard to find or be clear on the truth and step back and sift out what's real and what's opinion and, you know, and that sort of thing. So we probably have to think about how to use those tools as well, or at least, as you say, how to react to it if we can't do much about it. Arik, thoughts on that? Or?
Well, so the other domains, there are these three domains of control factors. We talked about contingency factors. The other two are dominion factors, the choices that I can make, and then influence factors, the choices others are going to make that I have to try and influence. And I think social is where that lives, and so does the news for that matter, is it lives in that kind of influence factor milieu that we see has been weaponized in the last couple of decades. And largely, I think we have to really be skeptical about the use of those sources going forward. I was talking with a guy who's not intelligence background, and I was explaining to him the difference between sources, methods, products, and yield. And so you guys, I don't have to explain it to you, but the misunderstanding happened around the yield part, which is the ability of someone who has authority to take the product and then turn it into a result. And there's an intermediary there around control that they have to reprogram. And it really is like a programming language. They have to turn certain subroutines on and off in order to produce that result in a reliable way. But it also involves, I think, understanding the real breadth of the topic sphere that is ahead of you. And so Helen, you talked about a lot of this is perspective on, whether something is positive or negative. Is it, how can it be put to work in a positive, productive, I think is probably a better way of describing it. How can it be put to work productively to produce that result? That's where I really have come to terms with my own, narrow ability. I think that's a big part of where we go as intelligence practitioners in the future, is you're going to see specialists continue to get more specialized, but you're also going to see a culture emerge, which, we experimented with this a couple of years ago at this conference I mentioned, where this culture of humility that is the prerequisite for managerial teachability. Back to that, is there anything I can teach you don't already know? Speaking to a couple of other teachers here, if the answer to that is no, then why would I waste my time? Why would I, and yours for that matter, it's a waste of your time for me to attempt to teach you something when you are not open to it. And I think that's, a big part of this is having a comfort. It's not comfort's not the right word. Tolerance is probably the right word. There are appetites and there are tolerances. I have a very low appetite for uncertainty, but I have a very high tolerance for it. I can handle it. I just don't like it. And that's the way a lot of people, I think, are in the intelligence world, is we have a big appetite for, or tolerance for uncertainty, even if our appetites are smaller. And so how we do that, I think, is a modeling culture. We model for those around us what that means, and we show them what it looks like. But at the end of the day, it's all about action. It's not intelligence if it's not actionable, right? So if you can't conceive of what that array of actions might be, that's the real value add. I think that, and I'll use the word strategic intelligence analyst here for the first time, I think, in this conversation. That's the real value of the strategic intelligence analyst, is the inventory of the array of options that lay ahead, and then a recommendation and rationale for optimality. Which of these will give us as stakeholders, Helen, as stakeholders, an unfair advantage in producing the yield that we seek to produce? And that's really the work. That's the meat and potatoes of what the intelligence analysts of the future will do. And as I have high schoolers now, and I'm starting to hang out more with high schoolers, I learned today actually that we have a program, and I think the member of my team, Austin, is in the audience right now, and good job on this, Austin. We have a program with a nearby high school where we have an internship program with them. And we're actually, I judge the success of that internship program based on its attrition rate. And the attrition rate is driven by whether or not those kids are pulling their own weight in that group. A few years ago when this started, we were asked if we wanted to make it officially a club. And of course, the cheapskate in me realized that means I'm going to have to pay for a teacher, right? And so the entrepreneur in me said, well, what happens if there's no teachers? It doesn't cost any money, right? We can just have this internship and it's unpaid, and they produce these analytical outputs, as part of their learning. I found out today, actually, that the Wisconsin Association of School Boards wants to talk to us about that, because it's a very aggressive way to think about how to prepare analysts for the future. Those kids are the ones who drive out those who aren't pulling their own weight, because it's up to them. There's no teacher there who's going to say, you got a B- and you're not, allowed on the team anymore. Nope. That's not how it works. I did some collegiate athletics, and I'll tell you, before the coach ever cuts you, your teammates cut you.
Yep.
And you get the message. Believe me, if anyone who's never played collegiate sports, you get the message that you've been cut by the team before the coach comes in and says, you're off, you're cut. So there is, that may seem harsh, but it's actually merciful. If you think of letting people pursue a career that they might just not be cut out for, because, you know, this isn't, this type of work is pretty, you guys know, this type of work is pretty, you know, throwing elbows half the time, trying to get people to do things that they don't have an incentive to do. Sometimes the odd curse word might be used in reference to an opinion that I might share. And can I let that hurt my feelings? Well, not anymore. So, you know, there's an element of this, which is kind of making your bones or cutting your teeth or, you know, proving your mettle. I think that happens when young people reach a point when they've decided that the intelligence, the strategic intelligence, analytical career is for them. And you need a sense of intestinal fortitude in order to do it. I think you really have to have a thick skin and not take criticism personally, and be able to let people call you names and not shrink, not back down on what you know to be real, what you know to be the truth, because you're there to serve them. And if they make themselves willfully helpless, that's on them. You know, that's not, our job is not to make them any less helpless if their will won't allow us to. So there, I think the cultural aspect, and that, by the way, is probably where I see CI going in the future, if it is to survive, by the way. And I think that's the thing about CI as a profession. We're going to have to really, really invest in the culture if we expect to see humans doing this 20 years from now, 25 years from now, and not software.
There are two things that triggers for me, Arik. And one of them, I guess I'd jump on first, which is what you led with early at the beginning of this conversation, that if you do this analysis and the company doesn't act on it, just whose fault is it? And this last bit sounded more like, well, it's their fault. You can only do what you can do. I do think there's a challenge and a tension there. Though, you know, the old saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. But you have to do all you can to try to make him drink is one thing that crosses my mind.
Yeah.
Taking responsibility. I think
it.
it's about taking responsibility and taking ownership for the results and the outcomes of the work that you're doing. You know, you really can't make people do the things that you want them to do. So, but you have to act like you can. I think you have to behave as if that is what's on the line, and that your reputation is attached to the success or failure of the work product that you're putting out. You know, and if you don't act that way, you're going to half-ass it. I really feel like that.
Right.
Another piece to this also, I agree with you 100%, and I would add, you also have to be really cognizant of who you're talking to, and what their perspectives are and what their proclivities are, and where their hot buttons are, what their needs are. Because some of this, if you're a good intelligence, I like strategic intelligence better, because I don't like separating them. I think any competitive intelligence group I've worked with that was not integrated into strategy, just, you know, was the first thing cut in a downturn, you know, because it's harder to prove their worth. But part of your job, I think, as a CI person is to sell it well, which I think Arik is saying, and he's right. And it's also to really understand who you're selling it to, because that's going to influence how you sell it. Yeah. And ultimately, I think it's really important. Look, you sell it the way you have to sell it. You always tell the truth. And you said something very early on, Arik, about there's a truth. You know, there could be multiple truths, and you might have to play out those multiple truths in scenarios, because you might really see it a certain way as an analyst, and you might have the data to back that. And if the person you're selling it to doesn't see that, You've got to find how they've gotten there. So you can find those places where there's some intertwine, and you can maybe help shift it, or, you know, show where it's really more in alignment than it doesn't appear to be, because it's always both. You know, you have to be a behavioral scientist to do this job well. It's not just
understanding the audience so that they can receive.
You got to use both sides of your brain there, the creativity and the analytics, and you got to bring them together, and even ask yourself how, you know, I've got this tough message to deliver, or I have a very important message to deliver. How would this person best hear it and most likely hear it so they can act on it?
And maybe when.
Both, you know.
Yeah, I remember working for people where if they had a bad afternoon, you saved your message for the next day, because things are more receptive. It's people, it's always people. I see that we have about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to declare failure in offering a break, because I don't, if we take a break now, we basically end it. I would put one more push to the audience. We've had that one question, we haven't had any others, so I'd like to invite that. And I think the only other topic that we hadn't talked about, to try to reconnect it also to some of the things that are happening now, is that in the last 6 months, we've seen a lot of trends that are long-term trends suddenly accelerate. All of a sudden, my 88-year-old mother is using, she's shopping for groceries online. That would, some of that will stick, some of that won't stick. That's one of the other things I think we have to interpret. And so I thought maybe we'd touch on that a little bit, see if any other questions come in, and then maybe some final thoughts and wrap this up.
Yep.
So you asking which trends do we think will stick, or are you asking?
How do you think about that more as a CI? I mean, your crystal ball isn't any clearer than mine, but we probably have to think about it. Is it going to continue that way? I mean, Arik talked to us a little bit about travel.
Yep.
And what's going to stick and what's not going to stick. I do think we will occasionally travel for business, but not nearly as often.
I think it's going to come down to a couple of basic things. What's made life easier? Because what's made it work better?
Mm-hmm.
On the positive side, and what do we really can't stand? And I think that's what's going to go away. I think it's going to, in a strange way, I think it's going to be this combination of business smarts and where we could be most efficient and effective, and also human need. Because I think we've had a lot of time to explore. Look, we're professionals, so we can make anything work. We can. You work hard enough, you're going to make it work. Doesn't mean you have to like it.
Right.
And I think those things that we find really make things happen better and less expensively and more responsibly and more sustainably. Hopefully that part of it will stick. Those things that worked okay and were easy might. Those things we hated, hopefully they won't as much. And I know that might sound very off the cuff, but I do think it's going to boil down that way.
Arik?
Yeah, I'll just say I think the evidence is a really interesting thing to look at. Our colleague Craig Fleischer did a series. We had a webinar series over the summer called Close the Distance. And we developed a couple of different analytical products in that webinar series. And one was called Winners, Losers, and Why. And so what are the winners doing? And then what are the losers doing? And, Barry, I told you this when we first talked in pre-brief, and I think I mentioned this to you, Helen, at some point since we've met, is that's the thing that all the history has in common for me. I am fascinated by losers, and it's all about the loser. At what point did their outcome tip from success to failure, or from mere possibility of loss to certainty of defeat? And I see a lot of things in our current lifestyle as Americans, but I think, humankind more broadly, Americans are an outlier, I think. And, the lifestyle of the average American household is not going to go back to what we had 6 months ago, because many of the trends that underlie what we have in this reality, September 15th, whatever it is, 2020, the reality today is merely a byproduct of factors that have been accelerated, as you suggest, Barry. And I don't think that there's not a lot new in there, is my point. This isn't a wholesale new, set of phenomena that produce this current reality. It's a lot of acceleration. And, if you start to then break that down across different verticals, that's how I think you're wanting me to answer the question, which is, what's changed? Well, food. Think of the food supply as a major aspect of this. Approximately 50% of the American diet was consumed outside the home, meaning restaurants, food service, etc. That is now about 4%. That is a monumental shift in demand that is not coming back anytime soon. That consumption outside the home.
Right. Partly by
exactly.
Much as
so
demand until it feels safe.
Right. So I had one of the shows over the summer, I had the founder of Culver's, which is a large fast casual restaurant chain here in the Midwest, and it's spread out in some places nationally. But Craig Culver was on, and we were commiserating over, boy, if only they'd had a second drive-through lane in every one of their restaurants, nothing would have changed.
Right.
Because they would have closed the dining room, and they would have just had a second drive-through lane where all of that dining room foot traffic would have gone through the drive-through. And they would have maintained, in fact, they've kind of grown during the pandemic because it's a pleasure, going to this restaurant and bringing home food for your family makes you feel a little bit better about being in the middle of a pandemic right now, because you may have noticed it kind of sucks a little bit. Certain aspects of this kind of suck. And so if you can bring your family home, like it was my wedding anniversary yesterday, and I asked my wife what she wanted to do, and she said, Chinese food. I haven't had Chinese food in 6 months. I want some Chinese food. So we brought home Chinese food, and we really enjoyed it. It wasn't the same as going to a Chinese restaurant, but that's kind of Chinese food now. You're going to bring home your Chinese food, and you're going to sit as a family. And so I don't see that coming back the way it was. And the consequences of leisure, and then hospitality and, hotel travel, that whole world, and even really the urban lifestyle, those are all different. And it's going to take a long time for that to return to what we used to have. Sorry, Helen, you get the last word.
Well, unfortunately, I think we don't, because we're at 2:29. So I think I kind of have to shift it, but, and say, well, leave on that upbeat note of at least you can think about the Chinese food as our, looking for the lining in the cloud. There's some pleasures we can take, even while things are tanking. But I think at this point, as a moderator, I have to say thanks very much for a great discussion. I really enjoyed it. I hope you did as well. That's supposed to be the cue that the thank you and goes up to the audience. Any of the three of us would be happy to receive an email from you, and so our contact information is now up on the screen. So we've enjoyed this conversation. I hope it's been helpful. What's coming next on the program is a break and some virtual exhibits that carry from 2:30 to 2:45. So with that, I think this is a wrap, and thank you very much.